As you might expect in a series looking at the Cold War, Cuban history has been a prominent feature. We've spent time looking at pre-revolutionary Cuba, the revolution itself, and of course the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, as well as American plots to overthrow the barbudo in charge, Fidel Castro. But this week, we're going to look at the domestic Cuban struggle against Castro that carried on for years after the revolution. I'm your host David, and this week we are going to look at the Escambray Rebellion. This is the Cold War. Father's Day is coming up, which makes this the perfect opportunity to choose just the right gift for him this year. That's why I am so glad to be working with the sponsor of today's episode, Ridge. Ridge is making it easy with one of their biggest sales of the year. Their modernized everyday accessories are up to 40% off through June 15th. You just can't go wrong with the classic Ridge wallet, with its sleek and modernized yet rugged design. It's built with military-grade materials for lifelong durability, and with over 30 different colors and styles to choose from, you'll be sure to find one that best suits Dad's personality and style. The wallet, with its lifetime guarantee, is even built to block RFID signals to fight digital thieves. And if your father has a massive bundle of keys, like so many dads out there, there's the Ridge key case. The key case is a quiet, easy, and hassle-free way to hold up to 6 keys, and just feels cooler than untangling key rings as you go about your day. The wallets and the key cases come with a 90-day return policy, so if your recipient doesn't like them, you can return them risk-free. And best of all, there's a load of other stuff included in the Father's Day sale too, so you're sure to find the perfect gift when you visit ridge.com/TCW. Save up to 40% before June 15th, and see why Ridge has over 50,000 5-star reviews. That's ridge.com/TCW. A key feature of many revolutionary movements is the coming together of various factions to work together towards the common goal of revolution. This can often present an image of unity or of solidarity, which in reality is only papering over cracks and divisions in the various motives and ideologies that sparked participants towards revolution in the first place. Cuba is certainly no exception to this, and the island experienced years of rebellion after the ouster of Fulgencio Batista, as opposition movements looked to undermine and even overthrow the Castro government before it could fully entrench itself into power. So, let's take a look. The flames of the anti-Batista revolution were still burning hot as Fidel Castro and his barbudos, the bearded ones, were establishing their own control over Cuba, and it did not take long before they found the new government opposed by other leaders of the revolution. It was only natural, of course, that not everyone who wanted to overthrow Batista would just fall in line with the socialist direction Fidel began to pursue, and even among communist sympathizers, there were those who disapproved of the newly established regime's growing ties with the Soviet Union. They were then joined by men who had served in Batista's armed forces, as well as other counter-revolutionary individuals, as well as paramilitary forces and agents who were on the American payroll. Now, there were others who took up arms against Castro who had little to no experience in warfare, but some of these individuals were the ones with the greatest motives to do so. They were the large landowners, those who owned more than 5 caballerias, or 165 acres, and therefore they were the rural bourgeoisie. These were the men who stood to lose their positions, their fortunes, and their influence. So, as soon as Fidel announced his agricultural collectivization policies, they immediately and openly opposed his regime by establishing various rebel groups that called the mountains in the central region of Cuba, the Sierra del Escambray, home. Through paternalistic tactics, intimidation, and sometimes deceit, they even managed to enlist to their cause many of the small landowners, the campesinos, who would otherwise stand behind Castro's agricultural reforms. But it wasn't only class that drove people against the communist regime. For Cuba in particular, race and gender also played an important role. As a former Spanish colony, as a former European colony, it should come as no surprise that most of the land was owned by Cubans of Spanish or European descent, white Cubans, and fear of communism spread the fear that Afro-Cubans would take over the island. Included in this was the fear that women would be forced into wage labor, and eventually the government would destroy the institution of family in general. And to be fair, Castro did announce in early 1959 that he would tackle discrimination and set racial integration as one of the regime's primary goals, though the panic that spread like wildfire through the racist bourgeoisie was rather illogical. But whether rational or not, the fear of the impending doom of the white patriarchal family and the slogan "neither black nor red" pushed many landowners to take refuge in the mountains of Escambray and to raise arms against Fidel Castro. By the fall of 1959, small bands of guerrillas, which the regime would dub banditos, had formed and were operating in the area of Escambray. This included the distinguished figure of the Anti-Batista revolution, Osvaldo Ramirez. Ramirez had fought as part of the Second National Front of Escambray against Fulgencio Batista's forces since 1958, and after the dictator's removal, he was rewarded with a position in the newly formed Revolutionary Police. Alarmed by Castro's socialist policies, and especially his agrarian reforms, however, he began orchestrating an uprising and eventually led 18 men into the mountains. Over the course of the following year, Ramirez's group would grow larger despite Castro's loyal militia actively pursuing them. Ramirez would soon be joined by many others, including William Alexander Morgan and Eloy Guiterres Menoyo. Morgan was an interesting case. He was a US citizen and had served in the US Army for 3 years before going AWOL, eventually receiving a dishonorable discharge. In 1957, Morgan traveled to Cuba to join the fight against the Batista regime. He fought alongside the revolutionaries of the Second National Front against loyalist forces, hiding in the Escambray Mountains, gaining invaluable experience and knowledge of the area, as well as the guerrilla way of fighting. In fact, he performed so admirably that he became one of only 3 foreigners to reach the rank of comandante, the other 2 being Menoyo and, of course, Castro's right-hand man, Che Guevara. Morgan's support for Castro, however, only lasted as long as Morgan believed that Castro was actually going to hold elections and restore parliamentary democracy. After Fidel's socialist leanings became more apparent to Morgan, he began collaborating with other revolutionary leaders looking to overthrow Castro and had weapons smuggled into Cuba to arm these self-called alzados, the freedom fighters. Unfortunately for Morgan, Castro became aware of his activities and ordered his arrest in November of 1960. 3 days later, while attending a meeting at the National Institute of Agrarian Reforms, Morgan was arrested by Fidel's men. On March 11th of the following year, William Morgan was put on trial at La Cabaña Fortress, where he was quickly pronounced guilty and sentenced to death by firing squad. Fidel and his brother Raúl personally watched the execution of their former comrade from the sidelines. Eloy Guiterres Menoyo, on the other hand, was a Spanish citizen whose family had been quite active during the Spanish Civil War and had then immigrated to Cuba in 1945. He was the one who had formed and led the Second National Front of Escambray and was regarded as one of the commanders of the revolution. However, Castro, while allowing Menoyo to retain his rank and therefore a portion of his power, strategically denied any meaningful position in his administration to Menoyo's men, successfully blocking Menoyo from challenging his own authority. Although he was sympathetic to the socialist cause, Menoyo disagreed with Castro's ties to the Soviet Union and joined the rebels in their fight against Castro. For his part, Fidel couldn't and wouldn't let the Escambray Mountains become a stage for counter-revolutionaries without putting up a fight. On the 17th of October 1960, he made public his resolve to see the war against the banditos through to its end no matter the cost. Quote, "If we have to be there 10 years confronting difficulties, we will be there 10 years. If we have to be there 20, 20. We know that it is a long battle." To that end, the government in Havana had earlier in the year established the Escuela de Milicias de la Campaña, a school for volunteers who wanted to fight the banditos. By the end of 1960, there were enough battalions of these now trained militiamen to begin a massive counterinsurgency effort named Limpia del Escambray, literally the cleansing of Escambray. But as we all know from our recent episode here on the Cold War channel, in April of 1961, Castro was up against a more important and potentially bigger threat as a group of US-backed Cuban exiles under the leadership of José Pérez San Román landed at the Bay of Pigs. The United States, by means of the CIA, was not only backing the invasion force, but also various insurgent groups in the Escambray. The mountains were meant to be the region for the exiles to withdraw to in the event the invasion went poorly. Men like William Morgan and Osvaldo Ramirez, whose anti-communist feelings were well recognized, were founded, supplied, and promoted as leaders around which the rebels could group. In the end, the invasion didn't go poorly, but was instead a total clusterfuck, so badly executed that none of the brigade even had a chance to make it to the Escambray. For the anti-Castro revolutionaries, the invasion at Playa Girón was a godsend, as Castro was forced to move many of his militia units to counter this new opponent, allowing Morgan and other groups some respite and an opportunity to regroup and reorganize their defenses. To some, it also seemed to present a golden opportunity to finally take the initiative and bring down Havana's communist regime. As we know, they couldn't have been more wrong, as the invasion turned out to be a complete fiasco. Due to various mistakes, the United States were ultimately forced to abandon San Roman's Cubans. In addition, however, because of Castro's extremely successful neutralization of CIA agents who were already operating within the country, the Americans also withdrew most of their support they were providing to the insurgents. This might seem weird, but let's not forget that the horse that the US had bet on to win here was Manuel Artime's Cuban exiles, and not the bandits hiding in the mountains. The men of the brigade were simply more reliable, and they actually coordinated their moves with Langley. The insurgents, on the other hand, due to a lack of radio equipment, were rarely able to contact the CIA. Indeed, they were so fragmented, they even had trouble coordinating the movements between themselves. So it's no wonder Washington lost interest in them after its gamble at the Bay of Pigs had failed so spectacularly. Despite not receiving much from Uncle Sam, insurgent activity under the somewhat overall command of Osvaldo Ramirez skyrocketed during the summer of 1961, as many who opposed Castro joined the ranks of the banditos. At the same time, Ramirez changed his tactics, focusing on targets that could double as political statements. But this renewed bandit activity also forced Castro to take harsher measures against the rebels. In November, he proclaimed Decree 988, under which any action against the revolution would be punished by death by firing squad. The decree also stated that those who provided their land to the bandits would have their land confiscated. This was a major blow for the counter-revolutionaries, who relied upon support from the locals, but also placed the civilian population in a bit of a predicament. They could, in theory, deny help to the rebels and keep their land. However, the reality was quite different, as captured insurgents often named those who had refused to assist them anyways as collaborators. Since the civilians were unaware of this particular tactic, it seemed to them that the government was going to take their land either way, and as a result of the decree, combined with the less than ingenious idea of implementing the first collectivization efforts in the Escambray region, many locals were driven into the welcoming arms of the counter-revolutionaries. Now, the collectivization effort was in itself a tragic page in the story of the residents of Escambray, and for some, it would be their last. Havana, at the same time as collectivization, also implemented a massive relocation program for those living in the mountains, something they would repeat in 1963, by the way, in order to deprive the rebels of local support. Families were torn apart, since depending on gender and age, people would end up in different parts of the island. For example, women were sent to Miramar in Havana for labor. Those who stayed back would work in camps under the watchful eye of the militiamen, who wouldn't hesitate to execute anyone they suspected of collaborating with the insurgents. The counter-revolution took another heavy blow on the 17th of April, 1962, when Osvaldo Ramirez and his men were encircled by Castro's militiamen, and in the ensuing fight, Ramirez was shot dead. His second-in-command, Tomas Sangil, succeeded him as the unofficial leader of the bandits, but he too would perish almost a year later. Not long after Ramirez's death, Havana, emboldened by their success, doubled down on their efforts to eradicate the insurgents still operating in the mountains, and so the second phase of the cleansing began. Fidel's forces employed what is called a fence and comb strategy. After an undercover agent would identify a potential rebel hideout, militiamen would encircle the target with several rings of soldiers, then systematically search every inch of the ground while closing in towards the center. In that way, escape for the insurgents was virtually impossible. Even if somebody managed to break through one ring of encirclement, he would be faced with another 2 or more. Through this tactic and their vastly superior numbers, Castro's men achieved victory after victory after victory, and many rebel groups were simply wiped out. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962 provided another brief respite for the counter-revolutionaries, as Castro was once again forced to pull his troops from the area in order to prepare for a possible US invasion, which this time didn't come. But once the crisis was past, Havana resumed its efforts in Escambray. In 1964, Castro's intelligence operations struck gold. An agent under the pseudonym Alberto Delgado had successfully infiltrated the ranks of the bandits while pretending to work at a farm. He was able to slowly convince the insurgents that his farm was a safe place, and knowing their desperate situation due to the lack of outside support, he provided them with a solution: an exit out of Cuba. For the tired men who had fought against Castro for so many years, and who were reaching the conclusion that they had no hope of achieving victory, this was an opportunity they simply could not let pass. But it was all a ruse. Over the course of 4 months, one by one, the rebels ended up in Cuban prisons until Delgado went a step too far and captured Julio Emilio Carretero, an important counter-revolutionary leader. His arrest promptly alerted the rest of the rebels to Delgado's true allegiance, and Delgado himself was killed a month later. However, he had already caused too much damage to the insurgent cause, depleting their ranks beyond the point of recovery. A year later, the hideout of the last major band of bandits, headed by Blas Tardio Hernandez, was located and its members were arrested. In July 1965, the very last rebels in the Sierra del Escambray surrendered, and the rebellion that had troubled Fidel Castro for so long was now officially over. At the same time the last of the insurgents were laying down their arms, Castro was at Santa Clara celebrating the 12-year anniversary of the attack on the Moncada barracks. He triumphantly declared that guerrilla warfare was a powerful weapon when used against colonialism and imperialism, but that it could never be used by the imperialists against exploited people. Fidel had fully brought Cuba under his control and was now ready to take the next step: exporting the revolution. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss any of our future episodes, be sure to like and subscribe and press the bell button, even if it means withdrawing to the mountains to wage a multi-year guerrilla warfare campaign with little chance of success. A huge thank you to all of our Patreon patrons, and if you aren't already, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.